If you've ever fished the rocky lakes of the Canadian Shield, there's a good chance the boat under you was a Princecraft, the riveted aluminum hull stamped with the name of a small Quebec town, the kind of boat that dents when it scrapes a rock and keeps going. At its peak, the Princecraft plant in Princeville was building 6,000 boats a year. They survived 7 changes of ownership, survived the move from wood to fiberglass to aluminum, survived an American hedge fund and a defective engine that bankrupted their parent company in 3 years. And then, on the 15th of December, 2,220 workers were sent home, and the plant sat dark. How does a company that survived all of that come back from the brink? What happened in Princeville? Chapter 1. A town called Stanfold. The story begins with aluminum, specifically with the aluminum that came out of the smelters at Arvida and Alma, the great Alcan complex north of Quebec City, where bauxite shipped from Jamaica met the cheap hydroelectric power of the Saguenay. And the result was sheet metal stacked on pallets, waiting for a post-war economy that no longer needed it. In 1945, every Allied aircraft factory in the world was running on aluminum. By 1947, most of them weren't running at all. The bombers had stopped, the demand had collapsed, and the smelters in Quebec were turning out a metal nobody knew what to do with. Alcan needed customers. It needed civilian markets, pots, pans, siding, kettles, and, eventually, boats. About 400 kilometers south of those smelters, in the rolling farmland of Centre-du-Québec, there was a small town called Princeville. It had been called Stanfold once, proclaimed a township on the 9th of July, 1807, by a Scotsman named Edouard Leclerc, with the first Acadian families arriving 25 years later. Names like Bellevaux and Pellerin that still appear on the war memorials and the parish rolls. By the early 1950s, it was a quiet French-Canadian town of dairy farms, sawmills, and a few small workshops, sitting in the l'Érable region, between Trois-Rivières and the American border. It was not the kind of place where you'd expect a boat-building empire to begin, but it was close enough to the smelters that a truck could make the run in a morning. And in the spring of 1954, 3 brothers from one of the oldest families in town looked at a stack of Alcan's surplus aluminum sheet, light, workable, and dirt cheap, and decided they were going to make canoes out of it. Their names were Lionel, Roger, and Sarto Baril. They had cottages on a lake, they knew how to weld, and they were about to spend the next decade quietly building the largest aluminum boat company in Canada, in a town most of the country had never heard of. Chapter 2. The Baril Brothers. Lionel Baril was the oldest of the 3, and by every account, the driver of the venture. He was a businessman by instinct, already running a small enterprise in town, already serving on the municipal council, already known at the local Caisse Populaire as the kind of man who could read a balance sheet and a room with equal speed. Roger and Sarto were his brothers, his welders, his foremen, his other hands. The 3 of them grew up in Princeville, went to school in Princeville, married in Princeville, and would die in Princeville. They were not aviation engineers. They were not metal workers from Hamilton or Detroit who had seen the future in aluminum. They were Francophone Quebecers from a small town who happened to look at the right material at the right moment. The company they founded in 1954 was called, with the straightforward practicality of the era, Aluminum Boats and Canoes. It started in a small workshop on the edge of town. The first products were canoes, light, narrow, designed for the kind of fishing trip where a man and his son could portage between lakes without throwing out their backs. The market was the Quebec cottager, the American sport fisherman who drove north for the summer, the trapper or hunter who needed something he could drag over rocks and not worry about. Within 2 years, they'd added fishing boats, 12, 14, 16 feet. By 1961, the catalog listed 11 aluminum models, ranging from a 12-foot car topper to a 16-foot runabout, along with a full line of fiberglass boats sold under a brand they'd licensed from Peterborough, Ontario. There were oars in the catalog, and life jackets, and trailers, and seat cushions. It was, as one chronicler later put it, a complete boating company. 8 years after starting in a workshop with a stack of Alcan sheet, the Baril brothers were selling everything a family on the Canadian Shield could possibly need to put a boat on a lake. The Canadian shield mattered. It still matters. The shield is what the Baril brothers were really building for. That vast crescent of ancient granite that runs from Labrador through northern Quebec and Ontario into Manitoba and the territories, where the lakes are deep and cold and the shorelines are rock. You couldn't beach a wooden boat on the shield without dreading what you'd find when you tipped it back over. You couldn't trust early fiberglass on it either. The gel coat cracked, the hulls cratered. The repairs ran into the hundreds of dollars at a time when a working man might be making 40 a week. Aluminum dented. Aluminum scraped. Aluminum took the abuse and stayed afloat. For a Quebec or Ontario fisherman who launched off a rocky cottage shoreline every summer and dragged his boat up onto granite at the end of the weekend, an aluminum hull from the Baril brothers was the right tool for the right country. In 1965, they made the move that would define everything that followed. They bought the Peterborough Boat and Canoe Company, the most storied name in Canadian boat building, founded in the 19th century, builders of cedar strip canoes that had paddled half the lakes in the Dominion. Peterborough was struggling by the mid-1960s, undercut by the same aluminum revolution the Barils had ridden into the market. The Baril brothers absorbed it, moved its fiberglass and cedar canvas production to Princeville, and added the Peterborough name to their own. A small Quebec workshop now owned one of the most famous brands in Canadian recreation. The Peterborough catalog went out under a Princeville return address. Lionel signed the check. Roger and Sarto stayed in the plant. 3 years later, in 1968, the Baril brothers sold the company. Not in distress, not under pressure. Lionel was in his 50s. The business had grown beyond what three brothers could manage from a small office, and the brilliant family from the Bas Saint-Laurent had made an offer that allowed all three of them to step back. They handed it over and went home. They had built it in 14 years from a workshop into a national brand. Whatever came next would no longer be theirs to drive. What came next was a procession. Chapter 3. Bought and sold. Between 1968 and 1985, the company that had begun as aluminum boats and canoes would change hands 4 times. It would be sold to a family in eastern Quebec, then to a holding company in Los Angeles, then to the aluminum giant in Montreal, and finally, in the move that mattered most, to 2 of its own managers in Princeville. Each owner left some mark on the plant. Each owner left some mark on the town. But for the men on the shop floor, the constant was the work. The canoes still came off the line. The aluminum still arrived on trucks from the smelters up north. The whistle still blew at 7 in the morning. The brilliant family of Rimouski held the company for only 2 years. They were a powerful Quebec dynasty. Jules Brillant had built a telephone empire in eastern Quebec before the Quiet Revolution swept it into Hydro-Quebec's orbit, and the family had cash to deploy and a taste for industrial holdings. But the boat-building business was small for them, and the distances were inconvenient. In 1970, they sold to Giffen Enterprise, a holding company out of Los Angeles. The company was renamed Canadian Boat Manufacturing. For the first time, the name Princecraft began appearing on the hulls. A marketing decision made in California by people who had never set foot in Princeville. But a good one, because it stuck. The Americans wanted distance from the original generic name. The locals wanted continuity with what they were already building. Princecraft satisfied both. The Giffen ownership was short and not particularly happy. American consumer goods conglomerates of the early 1970s were beginning to discover that running a small Quebec boat plant by remote control from Los Angeles was not as simple as the spreadsheets had suggested. 3 years in, Giffen was looking to sell. And the buyer that emerged in 1973 was the one that should have been there from the beginning. Alcan. The Aluminum Company of Canada, the same Alcan whose smelters had supplied the raw material since the Baril brothers' very first canoe, acquired the company outright, merged it with its Toronto-based Springbok aluminum line, and rechristened the whole operation Alcan Marine Products. Overnight, the small workshop in Princeville became the largest boat builder in the country. Springbok had been making aluminum boats out of an Ontario plant since the 1950s. Princecraft was bigger, growing faster, and sat next to a more flexible workforce. Alcan saw which way the center of gravity was going. By 1975, The company had built a new state-of-the-art plant in Princeville. Modern presses, longer assembly bays, dedicated paint lines. The old workshop on the edge of town was retired. The new plant rose where the cornfields ended. For 4 years, things ran. Alcon had the capital. Princeville had the workforce. The catalog grew, the boats shipped, and somewhere in a Montreal office tower, an aluminum executive could point at the Princecraft volumes and demonstrate that the company's downstream marine division was paying its way. Then, in 1979, Alcon closed the Toronto Springbok plant and moved everything south to Princeville. 200 jobs vanished in Toronto. 200 more arrived in Quebec. For Princeville, it was the moment the town tipped from being a place where some people made boats to being a place that was defined by boats. For Toronto, it was the moment a corner of its industrial economy quietly migrated to a smaller, cheaper town 300 kilometers east. By 1982, Alcon was second-guessing the whole arrangement. The marine division was profitable enough, but the parent company had problems on its mind that dwarfed any boat plant. The aluminum market was softening, the American smelters were underpriced by the Russians, and the strategic logic of holding a recreational manufacturer in central Quebec was getting harder to defend in the executive committee. The Peterborough fiberglass division was sold off that year. The signals were getting clearer. By 1984, Alcon had decided it was done with boats. The men inside the plant could read those signals as well as anyone. The general manager was a Quebecer named Marcel Dubois. The production manager was Jacques Dano. They had been running the plant day to day for years. They knew the suppliers. They knew the workforce. They knew which dealers paid on time and which didn't. And they knew that if Alcon put the company up for auction, it might end up in the hands of another remote conglomerate that would treat Princeville the way Giffen had, as a number on a quarterly report. Or worse, it might not be sold at all. In 1985, Dubois and Dagneau did something nobody in Princeville had quite expected. They bought it themselves. Chapter 4. The Two-Man Show. Marcel Dubois and Jacques Dano renamed the company Ultra Marine Products. Princecraft stayed on the hulls. The brand was the company's most valuable asset, and they were not about to retire it. But the holding entity above it was theirs. It was, as one boat-building chronicler later wrote, little more than a two-man show. 2 managers, a plant, a workforce of around 140, and a market that didn't entirely understand what had just happened. For the first time in 17 years, the company that built Princecraft boats was owned by people who lived in Princeville. You could see the change in the boats almost immediately. Dubois was a manufacturing man. He understood costs. He understood the shop floor. And Dano was the production engineer who'd been waiting for years to try things that the Alcon organization had been too slow or too cautious to approve. Within 2 years, they introduced the reverse chine, a small change to the hull geometry, a sharp lip running along the lower edge of the side panel that altered the way the boat sat in the water. Reverse chine boats tracked straighter, banked harder in a turn, and gave the helmsman a fraction of a second of additional control in a chop. For a sport fisherman cutting across a windswept lake at 30 miles an hour, that fraction of a second was everything. The reverse chine became a Princecraft signature. Within 5 years, it would become an industry standard. They added pontoons in the late 1980s, then deck boats. In 1992, they did something nobody else in the North American market had done. They built an all-aluminum deck boat, a category that had been a fiberglass monopoly until that moment, and they did it without lowering their durability standards. By the end of the decade, the Princeville plant was producing somewhere on the order of 6,000 boats and pontoons a year, in a complex that had grown to 3 buildings, with a workforce climbing past 200. Walk through the plant in 1990, and you would have seen something very specific. The morning shift arrived at 6:45, parked along the chain-link fence in pickup trucks and a few small sedans, mostly with Princeville plates. They went in through the same gate the Baril brothers had walked through 35 years earlier, except now there were 3 buildings instead of 1, and the gate opened onto a paved yard rather than a gravel one. Inside the main assembly building, the noise hit you immediately. The high whine of pneumatic rivet guns, the low rumble of hydraulic presses stamping out hull bottoms, the rolling clatter of the conveyors moving partially completed boats from station to station. The smell was specific and unmistakable. Aluminum dust, cutting oil, the faint metallic tang of fresh welds, all carried on the slight chill that the building never quite shed even in summer. The workforce on the floor was almost entirely French-Canadian, drawn from Princeville itself and from the small towns surrounding it, Plessisville and Lister and Sainte Sophie d'Halifax, names that have meant farming and forestry for 2 centuries, and that by 1990 also meant boat building. The accents on the floor were Centre du Quebec accents, hard and direct, with the rural cadences that newcomers from Montreal sometimes had to ask twice to understand. The conversations at break were about hockey, about the weekend, about whose son had just been hired into the rivet shop, and whose daughter had married whose. The radio in the lunchroom played whatever the Trois-Rivières station was carrying that week. The coffee was bad and constant. What they were building was specific too. Every Princecraft hull, then and now, was riveted from 5052-H36 marine-grade aluminum, a precise alloy specification that mattered enormously to the dealers, and almost not at all to the average customer, but that the management insisted on as a point of identity. Most competitors used H34, a slightly softer temper that was cheaper to form, and roughly 25% weaker in the relevant metrics. The Princecraft argument was simple. A Canadian shield fisherman who scraped his hull across granite every weekend was going to find out the difference. The boats were built to last 30 years on the water, and the ones the Baril brothers had welded in 1957 were, in many cases, still on lakes in Quebec and Ontario in 1990, scarred and dented and entirely functional, sitting at the end of cottage docks in their 3rd generation of ownership. That permanence was the product. That permanence was the brand. Chapter 5. The King of Princeville. By the late 1980s, the company was no longer just an employer in Princeville. It was the town's defining institution. The school board could tell you what the September enrollment would look like by tracking Princecraft's hiring patterns through the summer. The local credit union held more mortgages from Princecraft workers than from any other source of employment in town. The arena had a Princecraft sponsorship banner. The minor hockey league had a Princecraft tournament. The Friday lineup at the bank, when the paychecks cleared, was visibly longer than it had been in 1965, and visibly shorter than it would be in 2000. Princeville itself had transformed. In 1954, when the Baril brothers founded the company, the town's population sat just under 2,000, and its economy was still mostly agricultural. Dairy, mixed farming, a few sawmills cutting hardwood for local cabinet shops. By 1990, the town was approaching 4,000 residents in the urban core, and another 1,700 in the surrounding parish, and the dominant employer was a boat plant with the longest payroll the town had ever known. The Catholic parish church, Saint-Eusèbe, was the same one Lionel Baril had been baptized in. But the men filing past it on their way to the morning shift had different lunch pails. Princecraft pails, supplied by the company canteen, in a town where everyone now worked downstream from aluminum. The dealer network had expanded with the plant. By the early 1990s, Princecraft sold through more than 70 Canadian dealers, and a growing number of American ones, with particularly strong volumes flowing into Wisconsin and Minnesota, the pontoon boat heartlands of the upper Midwest, where the lakes were smaller and warmer than the Canadian Shield, but the cultural pattern of multi-generational family boating was the same. A Princecraft pontoon shipped from Princeville would cross the border at Champlain or Lacolle, run down the New York Thruway, and end up on a dealer lot in Eau Claire or Minocqua, where a Wisconsin grandfather would buy it on a fixed price the dealer had agreed to in Quebec 3 months earlier. The boats arrived on the back of trailers built by a small Princeville manufacturer called Remec, which by the late 1980s was shipping a trailer with nearly every Princecraft boat that left the plant. When you bought a Princecraft, you were buying a Princeville package. Hull from one shop, trailer from another, 6 blocks apart, both signed off by men who lived on the same streets. Inside the plant, Dubois and Deneau had built something distinctly Quebec in its operating culture. There was no aggressive American management consultant rotation. There was no European productivity team. The morning meetings were in French. The decisions were made by people who could be reached by walking 30 meters to the next office, and who, more often than not, had grown up within a half-day's drive of the plant. The supplier relationships ran deep. 50 to 80% of the revenue at the local sub-shops, the welding houses, the upholsterers, the marine electronics installers, came from Princecraft orders. When the plant had a good year, the town had a good year. When the plant placed a special order for a new run of pontoon decks, half a dozen small shops in Princeville and the surrounding villages knew about it before lunch. The company merged its Princecraft and Springbok lines under a single brand in 1989. The Springbok name, which had once been the dominant aluminum brand in Ontario, was retired by 1994, folded into the Princecraft identity, with a small notation on the logo indicating the OMC corporate parent. But that's getting ahead of the story. In 1990, before any of the OMC corporate notation appeared, the company was still Ultramarine Products, the operating brand was still Princecraft, and the man you would call if you wanted a meeting was still Marcel Dubois. It was, by any measure available at the time, the high point. 6,000 boats a year, 200 employees, the largest aluminum boat manufacturer in Canada, and one of the largest in North America. The reverse chine on the water, the all-aluminum deck boat coming out of design and into production, the dealer network spreading south, the Princeville workforce stable, well paid by local standards, and confident about what next year would look like. If you had asked Marcel Dubois in the autumn of 1990 what the next decade was going to bring, he would have told you, with some justification, that it was going to bring more of the same. The plant was profitable. The product was the best in the market. The American demand was real. The Canadian dollar was favorable. The two-man show had become a serious mid-sized manufacturer, and the next step looked like it would be a careful, controlled expansion. Perhaps another building. Perhaps a few more dealer markets in the American Midwest. Perhaps, at some point, a sale to a strategic partner that would give Dubois and Dano a comfortable exit and the workforce a guarantee of continuity. He was right about the strategic partner. He was wrong in ways nobody could have anticipated in October of 1990 about the continuity. Chapter 6. The Transom Wars. The phrase used in the marine industry, when people talked about it later, was the transom wars. The transom is the flat panel at the back of the boat, the part the engine bolts to. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the major outboard engine manufacturers in North America had arrived at a strategic conclusion that would reshape the boat industry within a decade. If you wanted to guarantee that your engine ended up on the back of the boat, the easiest way was to own the boat. The two giants were Mercury Marine, owned by Brunswick Corporation, and Outboard Marine Corporation, OMC, which made the Johnson and Evinrude lines and whose headquarters sat in Waukegan, Illinois. Between them, Mercury and OMC controlled the vast majority of the North American outboard market. For decades, they had competed for transom placement by selling engines to whichever boat manufacturer would order them. By 1990, both companies were buying boat brands directly. Mercury had Bayliner. OMC was acquiring everything it could get. OMC's acquisition list, by the early 1990s, ran to more than 20 brands. Chriscraft, Four Winds, Donzi, Stratos, Hydrosports, Sea Nymph, Lowe. The strategy was simple and, on paper, irresistible. Own the entire vertical, from the engine in the factory to the boat in the dealership, and capture the margin at every step. The boat brands gave OMC guaranteed engine placement. The engine business gave OMC the scale to keep cutting unit costs. The combined enterprise was, in the language of the era, fully integrated. Fully integrated, in the early 1990s, was a phrase that conferred almost magical confidence on the executives who used it. In the autumn of 1990, OMC's acquisition team arrived in Princeville. The price was never publicly disclosed. Marcel Dubois and Jacques Dano had built Ultramarine into Canada's largest aluminum boat manufacturer over the course of 5 years, starting with little more than the goodwill of their workforce and the patience of the Princeville Credit Union. Whatever they sold it for, it was enough. The acquisition closed quietly. The Princecraft brand remained on the hulls. The plant remained in Princeville. Dubois and Dagneau remained at the top of the operating chart. The only visible change at first was a small OMC added to the logo on the side of the boats, a quiet corporate notation that, on a 16-foot fishing hull at the end of a cottage dock in Témiscamingue, you would have to look closely to see. The workforce was told, with reasonable accuracy, that nothing was going to change. The new owners had bought the company because the company was working. Why would they change what was working? For a few years, nothing did change. The reverse chine kept selling. The pontoons kept rolling out the door toward Wisconsin. The dealer network kept expanding. In 1992, the all-aluminum deck boat finally went into full production, and the orders came in faster than the plant could fill them. By 1994, the Springbok name was being retired, and the unified Princecraft brand was selling in every province and across most of the Great Lakes states. The Princeville workforce had grown past 200. The town was, by any sensible measure, prospering. But the company was no longer owned in Princeville. It was no longer owned in Quebec. It was no longer, in any meaningful sense, owned in Canada. The decisions that would shape its next decade, its engine choices, its capital structure, its survival, or its disappearance, were going to be made in Waukegan, Illinois, by people who had never walked through the gate at the Princeville plant on a January morning, and who, by the late 1990s, would be making a series of choices that would end their own careers, their own company, and very nearly end the plant in Princeville along with them. The transom wars had a logic to them. The logic, in 1990, sounded reasonable. The logic, in 1990, sounded like the future. The men on the Princecraft floor went back to riveting hulls. Chapter 7. The Ficht that sank a giant. The problem with the transom wars, as it would turn out, was that they had been designed by accountants. The boat builder and the engine builder were two different businesses, with two different cost structures, two different product cycles, and two different kinds of customers. Owning both did not, in fact, double your margin. What it did was double the number of things that could go wrong at the same time. For most of the 1990s, this was a theoretical problem. The American boat market was booming. Cottage country was expanding from the Adirondacks to the Muskoka Lakes to the upper Midwest, and OMC was selling everything it could build. Then, in 1996, the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington issued new emissions rules for outboard engines. The old two-stroke motors that had been the industry standard since the Second World War, light, simple, reliable, and spectacularly dirty, were no longer going to be legal to manufacture in the United States after a phased deadline. Every outboard manufacturer in North America was suddenly racing for the same finish line. A clean two-stroke that could meet the new rules without abandoning the weight and simplicity that had made the old engines popular in the first place. OMC bet everything on a fuel injection system called Ficht. It was a direct injection technology, sophisticated on paper, and the engineering team in Waukegan promised it would deliver clean emissions, better fuel economy, and the same lightweight package that customers expected. The first Ficht engines rolled off the line in 1996 and 1997. They went on to Johnson and Evinrude outboards. They went into the dealer network. They went onto the backs of pleasure boats from Lake Champlain to Vancouver Island. And they began to fail. The failures were not subtle. At trolling speeds, the slow, careful idle that a sport fisherman uses when working a shoreline, the Ficht engines fouled, smoked, and knocked. At higher speeds, in extreme cases, pistons and connecting rods exploded out the sides of the engine block. The damage was not theoretical. Outboard repair shops from Florida to Ontario began reporting the same pattern of catastrophic failures. Dealers stopped wanting to sell the engines. Customers who had bought the engines wanted their money back. The class action lawyers began circling. The warranty claims began climbing. Inside OMC, the response was the response that engineering organizations under pressure tend to deliver. They redesigned. They issued software updates. They replaced components under warranty. They insisted the next generation of Ficht would solve the problems. Some of the fixes worked. Many of them didn't. The reputation damage compounded. Every dealer who had been burned on a Ficht warranty claim became a dealer who was reluctant to take the next year's allocation. Every customer who had blown an engine became a customer who would tell 10 others. In Princeville, the men on the Princecraft floor were continuing to rivet hulls, the same hulls they had been riveting since 1985. The 5052-H36 aluminum was still arriving on trucks from the smelters. The reverse chine was still cutting through the water the way Dano had designed it. The pontoons were still going to Wisconsin. The boats themselves were not the problem. The boats themselves had never been better. But the boats were now arriving at dealers with Ficht engines bolted to the transoms, and the dealers were beginning to ask hard questions about what they were being asked to sell. By 1997, OMC was bleeding cash. The company had lost money in 4 of the previous 7 years. Salomon Brothers in New York was retained to find a buyer. Detroit Diesel made an opening offer of $16 a share. It was a serious offer from a serious industrial company that understood manufacturing. It would, in all likelihood, have led to a methodical restructuring. Painful, but survivable. The Princeville plant would have been an asset within a larger portfolio of industrial holdings, run by people who understood how to run a factory. But on the 8th of August, 1997, a different bid arrived. $18 a share, in cash, from an investment vehicle called Green Marine Acquisition Corp. The principals were a New York investor named Alfred Kingsley and his partner Gary Duberstein, operating under the name Greenway Partners. Their backer was George Soros, specifically the Soros fund management vehicle Quantum, which had made its name and its fortune betting against the Bank of England in 1992 and was now, in the late 1990s, deploying capital across an unusually wide range of industrial bets. The price was $373 million for the controlling stake. The OMC board accepted. The company was taken private. The Detroit Diesel offer was withdrawn. And the future of every plant OMC owned, including the one in Princeville, was now, whether anyone in Quebec knew it or not, tied to the judgment of a hedge fund in New York City that had bought a debt-laden engine manufacturer with a defective product in the middle of a regulatory transition and intended to fix it by running it harder. In the autumn of 1997, a former Mercury Marine executive named David Jones was installed as CEO. Jones was a marine industry veteran, and his appointment was meant to signal serious operational expertise. For 3 years, he tried to turn the company around. He cut costs. He reorganized divisions. He pushed the Ficht redesign teams to deliver fixes faster. He sold off non-core assets. In Princeville, the operating reality stayed roughly the same. The plant ran. The boats shipped. The workforce hovered around 200. The Springbok name was retired in 1994. The brand consolidated. The dealer network expanded into deeper American markets. From the floor of the Princeville plant in 1998 or 1999, you would not have known that anything was particularly wrong. The whistle still blew at 6:45. The aluminum still arrived on trucks. The pontoons still rolled out the door. But the cash flow chart at headquarters told a different story. By the early months of 2000, Quantum had sunk more than $200 million into the company beyond the original purchase. Then, another $85 million in May. Jones resigned in August. A turnaround specialist named Roger Ficht was brought in. He was not given enough time. The numbers had stopped being recoverable. The Ficht recalls had eaten through the reserves. The dealer network had begun shifting orders toward Mercury. The lawsuits were stacking up in courts across 3 states. And the boat brands, Princecraft, Four Winds, the lot of them, including the small Quebec aluminum plant that nobody in Waukegan had ever quite known what to do with, were going to have to be sold. The men on the Princeville floor did not yet know any of this. In the autumn of 2000, they were running a normal production schedule. The order book was healthy. The American market was buying. The lakes of the Canadian Shield, far from any of the engineering laboratories in Illinois or the boardrooms in New York, were the same lakes they had always been. The signals, when they came fast. Chapter 8. 12 days in December. On the 15th of December, 2,220 production workers at the Princeville plant were laid off. The notification was delivered through the normal channels. The shop foreman passed it down the line. The shifts were stood down. The men cleaned their stations, hung up their coveralls, and walked out to the parking lot in the early dark of a Quebec December afternoon. Some of them had worked at the plant for 25 years. Some of them were the sons of men who had worked there before them. Some of them had been hired in the autumn intake and had been on the line for 4 months. There was, at that point, no public explanation that fully made sense. The order book had been healthy. The boats had been selling. The local press in Centre du Quebec carried short notices, but the reasons offered were the kind of corporate language: temporary production adjustments, parent company review, operational restructuring, that the workforce had learned, over a decade of hearing it from various owners, to mistrust. 7 days later, on the 22nd of December, the explanation arrived from Illinois. Outboard Marine Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code, listing more than $800 million in debts. Approximately 7,000 employees were laid off across the corporate structure within days. The Green Marine experiment, 3 years and more than $500 million of quantum capital in, was over. The Ficht engine had broken the company. In Princeville, the timing was its own particular cruelty. The layoffs had landed exactly 1 week before Christmas. The bankruptcy of the parent had landed 3 days before Christmas. The town that had built itself around a boat plant for 46 years was, for the first time since 1954, looking at a Christmas in which nobody was sure whether the plant was going to reopen in January or in March, or at all. What followed, in the documented record, is incomplete. The exact length of the plant's dormancy is not preserved in any accessible source. The specific recall of workers, when they were called back, in what order, on what basis, is not documented in the Quebec Corporate Registry or in the period press archives that survive in digital form. The brand histories that were written later by Princecraft and by Brunswick treat the handoff as smooth and rapid. The lived experience in Princeville, in those weeks, has not been written down in a form that can be quoted. What can be said is this: for somewhere between several weeks and several months, the men and women of the Princeville workforce did not know whether the plant they had spent their careers in was going to come back. The town's largest employer was, on paper, the property of a bankruptcy estate in the United States. The decisions about its future were going to be made in a federal courtroom in Wilmington, Delaware, by lawyers representing creditors who, in many cases, had never heard of Princeville. The town carried itself through that uncertainty with the kind of quietness that small Quebec towns have always carried hard winters with. The credit union extended terms. The grocer extended credit. The parish priest at Saint-Eusèbe added the workforce to the Sunday prayers. The mayor's office in the small municipal building made calls to Quebec City and to Ottawa, looking for any indication of what was being planned. The hockey season carried on. The school enrollment held. The snow came down through January and into February, the way it always came down through January, and into February in Centre du Quebec, settling on the empty parking lot at the plant and on the cars that weren't being driven there each morning. In Wilmington, the lawyers were sorting the carcass. OMC, in bankruptcy, was worth more in pieces than it was whole. The engines were going to one buyer. The boat brands were going to another. The Princecraft operation in Quebec was a peculiar asset within the estate, a Canadian subsidiary with its own corporate registration, its own workforce, its own dealer network, and its own brand identity. It could not simply be folded into the American liquidation. It had to be sold separately. The question was to whom? The answer turned on a regulator. The Federal Trade Commission in Washington had reviewed the structure of the OMC sale and concluded that if Brunswick Corporation, Mercury Marine's parent, OMC's largest competitor, were to acquire OMC's engine business, the combined enterprise would control approximately 80% of the North American outboard market. That was an antitrust problem of the kind the FTC did not approve. The engines, therefore, could not go to Brunswick. They were sold instead to Bombardier Recreational Products of Quebec, the Bombardier of Ski-Doo and Sea-Doo, headquartered in Valcourt, just over 100 kilometers south of Princeville, for the sum of approximately 95 million American dollars, in a transaction that also included the bulk of the OMC boat brands going to Genmar Holdings, an Irwin Jacobs vehicle based in Minnesota. But the FTC's objection only applied to the engines. The boat plants were a different matter, and Brunswick, having been blocked from the engines, was looking at the boat brands with renewed interest. The Princecraft plant in Princeville, an aluminum specialist with a strong Canadian market position, fitting cleanly into Brunswick's existing portfolio of Bayliner, Sea Ray, Boston Whaler, Lund, Crestliner, and Lowe, was exactly the kind of bolt-on acquisition the company knew how to integrate. On the 28th of February, 2001, Brunswick Corporation acquired the Princecraft brand and the Princeville plant. The price was not publicly disclosed. The Princeville operation became Princecraft Boats, Inc., a subsidiary of Brunswick's boat group, headquartered in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The management team that had been running the plant under OMC was kept in place. Brunswick made it known, through quiet channels, that the plant was to remain relatively autonomous. The dealer network was preserved. The 5052-H36 aluminum specification was preserved. The reverse chine was preserved. The Princecraft name was preserved. The men of Princeville, over the course of the late winter and early spring of 2001, were called back. The exact dates of the recall, as has been noted, are not preserved in the public record. What is preserved is the outcome. By the summer of 2001, the plant was running. By the autumn, the order book had been rebuilt. By the end of the fiscal year, Princecraft was once again shipping boats on remake trailers from the same loading bays the Baril brothers had built in 1975, and Alcan had expanded in 1979, and Dubois and Dagneau had run as their own from 1985 to 1990. The company had cheated death. The phrase, when it was used later, was used carefully. The death had been real. The plant had genuinely come close to liquidation. The American parent had genuinely collapsed and taken 7,000 jobs down with it. The fact that Princeville had emerged on the other side, with its plant intact, its workforce largely recalled, its brand preserved, and a new corporate parent that had every reason to want it to succeed, was not a foregone conclusion. It was the product of a Federal Trade Commission ruling about market concentration, a Canadian corporate structure that had been preserved as a separate operating entity, and a strategic interest from Brunswick that happened to align with the antitrust limits of the moment. It was also, in a way, that the men on the floor were under no obligation to articulate, but that they understood perfectly well the second time the plant had been rescued. The first rescue had been Dubois and Dagneau in 1985, when Alcan had decided it was finished with boats, and the two men who knew the plant best had bought it themselves. The second rescue, 16 years later, was Brunswick. A different kind of save, made by a different kind of buyer, for different reasons, but with the same outcome. The plant kept running. What had not survived, and was not going to survive, was the Quebec and Canadian fiberglass industry that had been Princecraft's competition for 40 years. Chapter 9. The Ones That Didn't Make It. In Grande Mer, 170 kilometers southwest of Princeville, there had been another Quebec boat builder. Its name was Doral. It had been founded in 1972 by a man named Moïse Cadorette, whose family had been making canoes in the Mauricie region since the 1930s, and who had decided, in the early 1970s, that the future was fiberglass cruisers built for the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. Doral grew quickly. By the 1980s, it was one of the largest fiberglass boat builders in eastern Canada, exporting to the United States and competing directly with American brands in the high-end recreational segment. By the 1990s, it was a fixture of the Quebec marine industry, a Cadorette family success story, a brand that meant something to anyone who knew anything about pleasure boating in the province. In 2010, Doral filed for bankruptcy protection for the first time. Its owner by then was a man named Denis Poliseno, who had taken over from the Cadorette family and had been struggling for several years against a rising Canadian dollar, a softening export market, and the long collapse of the North American fiberglass recreational sector. The company restructured, found new financing, and tried to continue. 2 years later, in 2012, Doral filed again. This time, according to the Quebec Marine Press at the time, the company owed approximately $5.4 million to roughly 150 creditors across Quebec, Ontario, and the United States. Polisano had rejected an emergency offer from Investissement Québec, the provincial investment corporation that had provided a $2 million startup loan in earlier years. There was nothing left to restructure. The company was wound up. The Grand Mère plant was sold. The Carteret name, which had been on Quebec waterways for 80 years, came off the hulls and did not return. Thundercraft, another Quebec fiberglass builder, had collapsed earlier, in the recession of 1991, swept away by the same wave that took down half a dozen smaller competitors. It had been bought by Carteret in its final years and absorbed, only for the Carteret parent to follow it down 2 decades later. Sunray, Princeville, Lucat, Marvac, Traveler, small Quebec fiberglass shops, all of them gone by the mid-1990s. None of them remembered now, except in the dealer catalogs that turn up at estate sales in towns along the St. Lawrence. In Ontario, the story was harder. Gru Manufacturing, of Penetanguishene and Owen Sound, was one of the oldest names in Canadian boat building. Its roots ran back to the Gidley works of the 1880s, when the Georgian Bay shore was thick with shipyards and pleasure boat builders catering to the Toronto rich. Gru survived the Depression. It survived the post-war transitions. It survived the move from wood to fiberglass. It did not survive 2011, when it entered receivership in circumstances that the Canadian Marine Press, even now, prefers to describe carefully. Its owner, David Cameron, took his own life in a confrontation with police in February of that year, after an episode of violence at the company's headquarters. The plant did not reopen. The brand did not survive. The Georgian Bay tradition of Gidley and Gru, more than a century of continuous boat building, ended on a winter morning in southern Ontario. Naden Boats, an aluminum builder out of Dryden and later Temagami in northwestern Ontario, ended in 2012, quietly, after years of declining sales. The Peterborough Canoe Company, the most famous Canadian boat-building name of all, had closed its doors in 1961, its brand later absorbed into Princecraft itself. Campion Marine, in Kelowna, British Columbia, was sold to a private equity firm in 2018. The Kelowna manufacturing was shut down and moved across the border into the United States. The Campion brand survived. The Kelowna plant did not. Ourston Glasscraft, founded on the North Vancouver waterfront in 1950, became the oldest continuously operating fiberglass boat builder in the world by virtue of outlasting nearly every competitor. The drivers of the collapse, taken together, were not mysterious. The recession of 2008 and 2009 had compressed the discretionary recreational market by a third. The Canadian dollar, which had spent decades below par with the American, climbed past par in 2007 and touched $1.09 American at its peak, a level that erased the export advantage Canadian builders had relied on for a generation. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1989 and its successor in 1994 had removed the tariff walls that had once made Canadian-built boats competitive in their own domestic market. Bombardier, the Quebec engine giant that had bought OMC's outboard business in 2001, exited the sport boat sector entirely in September 2012, judging it unprofitable. One by one, the names came off the hulls. What survived the cull, in the aluminum segment, was almost entirely owned by 2 companies. Brunswick had Lund, Crestliner, Lowe, and Princecraft. The remainder belonged to smaller American specialists or to private holding companies. The Canadian aluminum boat industry, as a freestanding entity with Canadian ownership and Canadian decision-making, had effectively ceased to exist by the time the smoke cleared. The plants that remained in Canada, and Princeville was the largest of them, were operating divisions of foreign-owned multinationals, run by Canadian managers, employing Canadian workers, and integrated into supply chains that ran across the border in both directions. This was the cost of the survival. It was not the same as failure, but it was not the same as the independence the Baril brothers had founded the company with, either. The flag on the plant in Princeville was still a Quebec flag, beside a Canadian flag, beside a small corporate flag with the Brunswick logo on it. The men on the floor were still the same men, drawn from the same towns, with the same accents. The boats were still the same boats. The 5052-H36 aluminum specification, the reverse chine, the rivet pattern, the warranty. None of it had changed. What had changed was the address on the corporate filing. Chapter 10. Still on the water walk through the Princecraft plant today, in the spring of 2026, and you will find a manufacturing operation that looks remarkably like the one Marcel Dubois and Jacques Deneau built in the late 1980s, expanded onto a footprint that has nearly doubled since the Brunswick acquisition. The complex now runs across 4 installations. The workforce has grown to approximately 390 men and women. The supplier network in Princeville and the surrounding L'Érable region, Rimex still building the trailers, the welding shop still supplying the subassemblies, the upholstery shop still cutting the seat coverings, generates an estimated 600 additional jobs across the local economy. The current president is a Quebecer named Rodier Grondin, an MBA who came in from Venmar and Braun-Newton in 2018, reporting to Steve Langlais at the Brunswick Boat Group in Fort Wayne. The customer experience and marketing director is named Jean-Philippe Martin Dubois, a surname that anyone in Princeville will tell you has been associated with the plant for 40 years. Though whether the connection to founder-buyer Marcel Dubois is a direct one is a question that has not been answered in public. The company invested $2 million in plant improvements under Grondin's first year. In 2024 and 2025, it committed more than $4 million additional dollars to a new powder coat paint facility, the largest single capital investment in the plant since the early years of Brunswick ownership. During the pandemic, when North American consumers turned to outdoor recreation in numbers no manufacturer had anticipated, the Princeville order book ran at approximately 150% of capacity. Grondin, speaking to the Quebec business press, called it du jamais vu, never seen before. The plant added shifts. The plant added workers. The Wisconsin and Minnesota pontoon orders ran through the back of the catalog and into custom builds. The 5052-H36 aluminum kept arriving on trucks from the smelters up north. The reverse chine kept cutting through the water. The Princecraft logo on the side of the boat, no longer with the small OMC notation, replaced now by a small Brunswick designation that most customers never notice, kept going out the loading bay door. In 2024, the company celebrated its 70th anniversary. The branding for the occasion was L'Esprit du Nautisme, the spirit of boating. The current line runs to approximately 86 to 90 models across fishing boats, deck boats, and pontoons, under names that have accumulated over decades: Ventura, Vogue, Vectra, Quorum, Sportfisher, Jazz, Voyageur, the Brio Electric. Princeville itself, the town that the Baril brothers had founded the company in, has grown to roughly 6,500 residents, with the highest manufacturing density of any Quebec town of fewer than 10,000 people. Princecraft, by any honest accounting, remains le roi de Princeville, the king of the town it has built itself around for 7 decades. Other industries in town have come and gone. The Alamel pork plant closed in November 2023, taking 301 jobs with it. The Guitebec guitar factory, a small Princeville facility making the Godin line, closed in 2025, taking 11 more. The trailer manufacturer Rimex is still running. The cheesemakers and the agricultural co-ops are still running. Princeville is, among other things, claimed as a birthplace of poutine, a culinary detail that the Chamber of Commerce mentions whenever the question of regional identity comes up. But the boats are the through line. The boats have been the through line since 1954. Chapter 11. The quiet. After. There is a particular thing that happens when you stand on a dock on the Canadian Shield in the early morning, in the second week of July, and you look at the aluminum boat tied off at the end of it. The hull is dented in 2 or 3 places. The paint is faded along the gunnels. There is a small repair patch along the bottom of the transom, where someone has welded over a hole made by a half-submerged rock at some point during the Mulroney years. The seat cushions have been replaced more than once. The steering wheel has been replaced. The outboard is on its 3rd engine. The hull is original. The hull was made in Princeville. It might have been built in 1973, when Alcan had just bought the company and rechristened it Alcan Marine Products. It might have been built in 1987, when Dubois and Danault had been running it for 2 years and were just starting to introduce the reverse chiny. It might have been built in 1999, with a small OMC notation in the logo that a careful eye could pick out from 20 feet away. It might have been built in 2008, with the Brunswick designation in its current discrete form. The hull does not know which year it came from. The hull is still floating. A Princecraft aluminum boat, properly cared for, lasts somewhere between 30 and 50 years on the water. Many of them last longer. The ones the Baril brothers welded in 1957 in a small workshop on the edge of a French-Canadian town that had once been called Stanfold are in some cases still in use, sitting at the end of cottage docks in Témiscamingue and Mauricie and the Laurentians, in their 3rd or 4th generation of family ownership, scarred and worn and entirely functional. That is the product. That has always been the product. The factory that built them is still running. The town that built the factory is still standing. The smelters at Arvida and Alma, 400 kilometers north, are still shipping aluminum south. The men and women on the morning shift are still walking through a gate that has been there, in one form or another, since 1975. The accents on the floor are still the accents of Centre du Quebec, hard and direct, with the rural cadences that newcomers from Montreal sometimes have to ask twice to understand. What was almost lost in December of 2000 and January of 2001 was not the brand. The brand could have been bought by any number of buyers and continued, in some form, somewhere. What was almost lost was the place, the plant. The men and women who knew how to build a Princecraft hull because their fathers had built Princecraft hulls before them, and because their hands had been doing the work for so long that the work had become a kind of language. That language is still spoken in Princeville, not because anybody designed it that way, not because Ottawa or Quebec City intervened to preserve it, not because the Brunswick Corporation, in the calm of its Illinois headquarters, set out to protect a small Quebec town as a matter of cultural policy. The plant survived because the Federal Trade Commission in Washington blocked an antitrust transaction, and because the Princecraft corporate structure had been preserved as a separate Canadian entity, and because Brunswick had every reason to want a healthy aluminum operation in the Canadian market. The survival was structural. The survival was contingent. The survival could very easily not have happened. It did happen, and the boats are still going out the door. Somewhere on the Shield this morning, a man in his 60s is putting his coffee thermos in the bow of an aluminum fishing boat his father bought new in 1981. He will run it across a lake that has not changed appreciably since the last glaciation, to a small bay where the walleye come in close to the shoreline in the first hour of light, and he will fish until the sun is too high and the bite is gone. The boat will dent a little more before he comes back in. The hull will scrape on a rock at the takeout, the way it has scraped on rocks since 1981, and the metal will hold the way the metal has always held. The plant in Princeville will be running. The aluminum will still be arriving. The work will still be the work. That is what was almost lost. That is what remains.